Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Tartlecast. I am joined by an extremely special guest today, and I am thankful to have a moment of his time, Leo Tilman. He is the foremost leading thinker on risk, and I don't put that lightly. He is coming with many badges of honor, accredited and spoken to about by some of the world's top dogs when it comes to risk, either in a military effort or in an effort for large Fortune 500 organizations. Leo, thank you so much for coming on to join me today on Tartlecast.
It's truly a pleasure, Alexander. Look forward to our conversation.
Oh, it's going to be fantastic. And just so the audience knows, you had wrote this pretty phenomenal book on agility. And for many that don't think about agility, many people that take very conservative approaches to their work or to their life, that can actually create undue or unneeded risk within whatever their workflow or daily life might be. So when I went through and read your material, I was like, the application of this, the knowledge needs to continue to be shared. And you touched on a very fundamental point that aligns a lot with what we talk about. And that's the point around data. And so when you think about agility, right, I think that I need information to be agile. How is it that you define information, Leo? Like in terms of that agility?
Great question. And again, it's something that we have thought through for a very long time. And it stems from a belief that we had for many years now, that the greatest challenge facing organizations, individuals, governments is to be able to navigate this radical disruption and accelerating change and uncertainty that surrounds pretty much any realm in which we operate. So defining agility and creating this entire theory and framework for agility was an attempt to say and to clarify what does this mean to be agile, and what does it take in terms of knowledge, capabilities, cultures, processes. And of course, our work was written for organizations, but it definitely applies to individuals and investors and not-for-profits as well. So to us, agility is the capacity to detect, assess, and respond to change. And what makes agility fundamentally different from flexibility or adaptability is the fact that while we detect, assess, and respond to change, we do it in ways that are purposeful, decisive, and grounded in the will to win. And of course, as you can imagine, every one of these words is a loaded one, and we can definitely dive in. But that was our attempt, and it stemmed from the challenge that we thought everybody was facing, but also the lack of clarity, and everybody is sort of using these words very, very casually, and not differentiating between core competencies that are vital in this environment.
Right, and you think about core competencies, you think about agility, you think about these terms that you say are loaded. They really require definition, because definition allows you to have proper intention about how you act upon it. So if I had a lens of this world to absorb information, Leo, I need to have a specific intention of how to act. But if I can't define my lens for how I view this, well, then I don't really know how to receive all the information coming in. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I think it's a two-part question. Part one is your notion of data environment, and I'd love to talk about that. And the second one is how do we specifically use this information, and how do we determine what information is relevant? So would love to comment on the first one. So when we think about agility or the general capacity to navigate disruption and change, you need to first and foremost ask the question of what is the nature of the environment in which we operate, right? Because it's not possible to define what it means to be agile without fully understanding the environment in which you operate. And to us, this environment consisted of two parts. Part one are the dominant trends that are shaping our world today, right? The fourth industrial revolution, geopolitical conflict, climate change, bio events like the pandemic, coupled with societal dislocations, nationalism, populism, the arms race of technologies. So that's the environment. And thinking very precisely about what these trends are and how do they create this new normal is very important. So one part of the data environment is how do we describe and conceptualize the big trends that are shaping our world. But equally importantly, there's another component to this discussion, and that is diving into the fundamental nature of environments. And it's fascinating to read, for instance, Clausewitz on war or works of that kind, which are 200 years old, and yet they describe the nature of conflict and the nature of competitive environments incredibly precisely. And we can totally recognize all the things that they talked about. So we dove into that question as well. And into Clausewitz, for instance, any environment of conflict and competition and dynamism was enveloped by what he called fog and friction. Fog is the informational ambiguity. It's the fact that we don't quite know what's happening. And almost irrespective of how hard we work, there will be certain aspects of this environment that we just don't know, right? And the friction is uncertainty. It's the fact that, we start implementing our plan and something unexpected happens internally or externally, or our competitors behave in unexpected ways, or there's some sort of geopolitical event that completely changes the environment. So being very proactive about thinking about the trends, thinking about the kind of data you need, but also acknowledging that all of this is enveloped in this fog and friction and chaos is really helpful in trying to figure out what we need to make decisions, but also how we will be making those decisions under uncertainty.
That's super interesting. And I know that Clausewitz, they still teach Clausewitz at some of the top military schools around the world. Even though the literature is that old, the framework, the definition of dealing with fog or friction can be applied to many other methodologies and approaches that we're currently using. Whether you're in physical combat, where it's one enemy against another, or you're dealing in competitive environments like one large corporation or organization against another, the same rules still tend to apply. And so having the upper hand really deals a lot with having the knowledge and information, the data, and learning how to act upon it. And so that leads me to that question where if we think about the fourth industrial revolution, all right, and data being the key driver for all the spokes, all the systems in this battlefield, how do you see the role of data in decision making? And considering the fact that you have the fog in the environment, which creates that complexity, how do you see that actually, evolving?
Absolutely. And I think one of the ways to do that is to think deeply about these steps for agility, right? First, we want to study the environment so we can detect a change in the environment that matters to us, right? The second one, once we detected it, we have to assess what it means in terms of the signal, but also what it means in terms of our potential actions, right? And then we need to shape the action and execute it, right? So from this perspective, it becomes quite pragmatic, right, of how you would think about information. So detection, right? So what are the things in the environment that we need to monitor and detect in order to be agile? Well, part of it is those dominant trends that are happening, right? Part of it is the nature of the uncertainty that surrounds our world. But there are other anchors that can really focus our attention on the right information. One anchor is your strategy and leadership priorities, right? If you have a clear vision for the role that your organization wants to play in this new normal, right? Then its strategy and its priorities will imply certain information that you need to make those decisions. If you want to capture new market shares, or you want to develop new products, or you want to engage clients on a new level, just thinking deeply about these priorities will inform us what type of information we need to monitor this, to think about, et cetera. So grounding the conversation about data and information in strategy, vision, priorities is one big direction that we take with our clients. The second one is equally interesting and unusual, and that is, how do you use risk management and how do you use risk intelligence in trying to answer the same kind of question? And that would be a different kind of a conversation where you would say, okay, so let's look at our organization. And let's look at what we call its portfolio of risks, meaning what risks we take in order to deliver our products and services, run our organization, make sure we're resilient, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where the wealth of the entire field of risk management comes into the conversation, where we systematically go through financial risks, operational risks, strategic risks, et cetera. The moment we know what type of portfolio of risks underlies our current organization and how this portfolio of risks could change as we evolve our strategy and develop new things, that informs us too about the kinds of things in the environment that we need to watch. So one of the typical conversations that happens with boards and executives of large companies is they acknowledge the fact that they don't spend enough time thinking and discussing these types of issues about the broad environment in which they operate. And then there's a lack of internal clarity of what we should be looking at. And so because there are infinite number of things that we can look at in the environment, which ones are relevant? So these two complementary approaches that stem from agility, one is the role of strategy and vision, and another one is the role of risk, really focuses our attention on what matters.
So if I understand this properly, if I set a specific intention, if we have clarity and discussion around our strategy, it will afford us the filter for the data that we have coming in so we can analyze what we have control over and what we do not, and then where we can act dealing with that new risk profile that has afforded us for how we want to direct our company going forward. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. It will also force us not only to have a discussion on the kinds of things that we need to be watching in the environment and thinking about, but it will also beg a question of what information do we have and what information don't we have, right? Because one of the biggest challenges today stems from the fact that large organizations have infinite amount of data, an infinite amount of things that they could be analyzing and looking at. On the one hand, it creates a sense that we have everything that we need to have, and it's just a matter of synthesizing it. And the biggest challenge there is to synthesize it in ways that are conducive to effective decision making, but also figure out what part of this data is relevant to us. And again, that would be connected to strategy and vision and priorities, et cetera. But this conversation will also make us realize something that is timeless, and that is truly valuable information about our clients, right, about our competitors, about our adversaries is really not readily available. So what can we do to really fight for risk intelligence, which is the concept that we created, which tries to emphasize that this is not a passive exercise. This is not an exercise of sitting back and having all of this data come at you and then just trying to determine what is relevant. It's a matter of dedicating time and resources, and in the military context, dropping special forces behind the enemy lines to truly understand what is happening. There are analogs of that pretty much in every realm. So fighting for intelligence that we must have, even though that intelligence is hard to get, is an important part of this conversation.
Right. And, I had shared with you, how the total marketplace operates. And you say you need sort of that inside edge. You need to understand the people that support those systems. So if I were to take the proactive approach for my business and understanding what our strategy and our risk currently is, I would want to go out and source that data from those individuals directly, which support our organizations as a whole, nationally or internationally, right? So if I'm dropping myself behind enemy lines, I would jump on the Turtle Marketplace and say, well, let me go speak with those other people on the other side. Let me meet them on that bridge. And that would afford me information and agility to act upon that. So then that begs the question then in my mind. So how do you see businesses overcoming this challenge that you speak of? Finding that agility, getting behind the enemy lines. Is it using marketplaces like ours to source data from individuals, directly, or do you find other specific avenues that they may be taking to acquire that information?
Well, look, there are no generic answers to this question, right? It all is a function of what business are we in as a company, what is our strategy, and what information we have determined that is a must-have to make effective decisions and become super competitive and effective. Sometimes it's a matter of tapping external resources in the way that you described. And more often than not, there's a very concerted conversation to be had is where do we think this data is available? How we would engage the relevant stakeholders? How would the business model work, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't spend as much time on that part knowing that there is an infinite number of possibilities and each company would try to determine these things in the regular course of business. Our focus was almost on the internal side of things. And it stemmed from the fact that more often than not, profound changes in the environment start to come in at the very edges of the organization in super ambiguous ways. And it takes someone who is alert and professional and understands our priorities to say, something is up. I just heard something from a client that doesn't make sense, or I just learned about something that our competitors are doing, which is different from what they have done before. I know that this information is relevant to senior decision makers at our organization. We have the culture where even if I'm wrong and I'm crying wolf, my feedback would be welcomed and rewarded. And I would not be penalized either for bearing bad news or for distracting people from what they're doing. So all of a sudden, there is the knowledge component to it. There is the process component to it. And there is the culture component to it. And all have to work together in order for us to be able to detect these really ambiguous things that are happening and then conceptualize them and escalate them to the right folks.
So, and I want to make sure I have this correct. You can have all the information in the world. You can have all the strategy in the world. But unless you have the culture, the flexibility as human beings to take in other inputs that may well, in fact, challenge the status quo of what you do, and that may be the data that's challenging it, you still have to be flexible enough to adapt to it, to be agile within the culture itself. If that is not a human element that is actually accruing to you, then everything else is really for naught. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. And so far in our conversation, we have focused mostly on what it takes to detect and what should we be detecting and what kind of information is relevant and how do we figure it all out. So it's amazing that we spent half an hour just on one step of this process, and that is of conceptualizing the environment and deciding what we're going to watch and why, right? What you brought up now is the step of assessment, right? Because on the one hand, you have these ambiguous, super complicated things coming our way, and we need to figure out what do they mean in general and what do they mean to us? And then we have to say, okay, so if that's the case, what should we do? Should we create a response? Do we think that deliberate inaction is the right strategy? So this assessment part is super complex, right? Because it involves a great deal of knowledge, multidisciplinary knowledge. It involves a great deal of uncertainty, right? So as you said, if you don't have the culture where dissent is welcomed, not only welcomed, but it's expected, where leaders don't monopolize conversations and stifle the discussion, where everybody feels that getting to the truth, getting to the bottom is the most important thing, and it overrides hierarchies and ideologies and etc. We can't figure out because what we're dealing with is just too complex. So
Right.
the role of knowledge, but even more importantly, culture in this assessment step is super critical.
That's interesting. And so do you think it would behoove organizations to do cultural assessments of themselves ahead of time? Because you could be taking all this data in, but have a lot of inaction on it, or no, even if you step in with your own firm to advise somebody, that yes, you have all this, but it won't be for any good because of these cultural barriers that you currently have. So no matter how well we understand our clients, no matter how well we understand human beings, if we don't understand ourselves, then we can't help anything else. So all this outside data that we're pouring in, putting resources into, trying to get, we need to have our own internal cultural data very well understood to move through essentially our internal fog.
Alexander, I really enjoyed our conversation. I think the issues that you're bringing up are fundamental. And as I mentioned before, in frank conversations, boards and executives openly acknowledge the fact that they're too busy to spend time on something this fundamental, in that sometimes they feel that they're flying blind in the face of disruption and change and uncertainty. But there's definitely a movement. There's definitely a realization among senior decision makers that intelligence gathering, risk management, planning are integral components of any kind of successful agile organization. And they also are starting to realize that agility in the way that we describe it, in the capacity to navigate disruption and uncertainty, has two equally important components. One is a strategic agility, which is the capacity of the leadership teams to respond to major changes in the environment and reposition entire enterprises in terms of products, services, business models, human capital to this new reality. And the second one is a tactical one. Once we have the strategy, once we dispatch our whole organization to go and implement it, everybody in this process will encounter their own challenges and surprises and changes in the operating environment. So they too have to go through detect, assess, and respond process at their own organizational level. And it takes both. It takes both strategic and tactical agility to really be successful in a disrupted environment like we're in today. So data plays a huge role in detect, assess, and respond, both on the strategic level and the tactical level. But as we discussed today, having the framework of how to put this all together, having the right processes, knowledge, cultures are equally important. So when that all works in unison, it becomes really powerful.
Wow. Leo, thank you so much for coming on and sharing that. I really do appreciate it. And like us on this call, we had to be agile, and we've seen that there are benefits from it, and this knowledge can be shared. So thank you again very much for coming on the TartleCast.
Truly a pleasure.